Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Without further ado, we're already a little bit late, so we hate to take that out of Roundtable. We're very excited today to have with us Matthew Hart, Jason Franklin, Diana Samarison, Mona, Sean, and Katie Love. I will let them introduce themselves, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. No. Okay. Hello? Does that work? Until I just hold this? Okay. He's signaling me to put it on my dress, but all right. Tell me if you can't hear me. Signal me. I'm going to.
Yeah.
Good?
No.
No? Okay. I'm just going to keep it over here. All right. And I won't introduce us with the men first and then the women. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us after lunch. I hope we can keep you awake after a lovely lunch. But we'd like to thank the University of Dayton Human Rights Center for inviting us here to talk about a human rights-based approach to human rights grant-making. So during the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, René Cassin said it would be deceiving the peoples of the world to let them think that a legal provision was all that was required, when in fact an entire social structure had to be transformed. At this conference, Exploring the Social Practice of Human Rights, this panel will be discussing the social practice and structures of human rights funding and how it is transforming. I'm Mona Chan. I'm the Executive Director of the International Human Rights Funders Group, IHRFG. IHRFG's mission is to advance human rights through the strengthening of philanthropy and effective philanthropy. And we provide research and educational convenings and a networking space for a global network of approximately 350 funders or grant-making institutions. I'm joined here by my peers and IHRFG members, Matthew Hart, who is the founder and principal at the Paris-based international consulting firm, the Lafayette Practice, Diana Samarison, who is the founding executive director of the Disability Rights Fund, which is an international grant maker supporting the activism of the disability movement in Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. And she's also on the steering committee of IHRFG. We have also Katie Love, who is the senior program officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit organization that supports Wikipedia. And Jason Franklin, who is the W.K. Kellogg Community Philanthropy Chair at the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy. So to tell you a little bit more about the hour ahead, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction and then turn it over to you for a brief reflection. And then we'll come back to the panel for an interactive conversation with everyone here. So recently, a program officer at one of the top 10 foundations funding human rights in the world said to me, "We fund human rights, but we're not human rights funders." Now I thought, okay, I don't know what you're talking about, but you have lots of money, so I'm just going to agree with everything you say. Isn't that the way we always interact with funders? But I did ask him to elaborate, and he explained that as a private foundation, grant-making decisions are made from the top, behind closed doors, and are accountable to no one. So this is not a human rights-based approach to supporting human rights. So what did he mean? Human rights-based approaches are about transforming human rights from purely principles, standards, legal instruments, into effective policies, practices, and practical realities, something that we've been talking about all morning. And it's emphasizing how human rights are achieved. And so in grant making, as other human rights work, this means allowing for participation, accountability, and transparency. So before we talk a little bit more about participatory grant making, I'd like to start with a quick participatory exercise. Now, since it's after lunch, I thought I might try to get you to stand up and spell participatory with your bodies. But rather than do that, I'd like you to turn to the person next to you and think about your work, your research, your advocacy, or an issue that you're very passionate about. And think about how that work might be transformed or changed by using a human rights-based approach, specifically incorporating stakeholder participation. So I'll give you 5 minutes. Turn to the person next to you. Give your partner a chance also in a couple of minutes to share how might the work that you're doing be transformed by using a participatory approach. 5 minutes. Go for it.
Great. Are these still on? And then after this, you'll get some feedback, and then I go? Is that how it goes? Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if I want to keep talking into it. Okay, 2 more minutes. Switch. I saw it last night, yeah. I didn't. Just 1 more minute. Okay. I'm gonna thank you for participating. I'd love to get maybe one example from the audience on how their work could be transformed by using a more participatory approach. Anyone? This is like our US democracy. We have the chance to participate, but do we? I'll just wait. Okay.
Basically, I find out from young people what they feel about privacy and related to the Facebook generation. I deal with privacy and privacy-related projects. I'm confused about why people put material online as much as they do, but if I listen to people, I might find out, and those folks would direct, the young people I would be talking to would direct my future efforts in so many different ways if I would listen.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share an example? Can someone reach the mic? Sorry.
The mic is wireless if you just want to grab it.
Thank you. I think that helps for live streaming too.
Hi. I had remembered one of my professors giving an example in class of some organization installing running water in the homes of some people in Afghanistan, and how what they didn't realize is that when the women would go to the well or wherever to collect the water, that's where they would socialize and interact with each other. So if they had, kind of talked to the community members to see what they wanted exactly, they would have seen that maybe the wells were a better idea, and they could have talked to them and seen what would have worked better for them.
Great. Thank you. So why are we talking about this for human rights funding? IHRFG does research on human rights grant making, and according to IHRFG's research, in 2012, 774 foundations in 44 countries made nearly 19,000 grants to over 10,000 NGOs, totaling $1.8 billion in support of human rights. But how can we avoid perpetuating inequality in our grant-making practices? Here's one way. Matthew is going to share some findings from his recent seminal research on participatory grant-making.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Hart, and I would like to just see a quick raise hands of who has presented after lunch? Anybody? Great. So you're with me, right? You're with me. Together we're going to get through this. So my name is Matthew Hart, and I'm the principal of the Lafayette practice, which is a Paris-based consulting firm, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to present a small little window into our research, who decides how participatory grant making benefits donors, communities, and movements. So this is a much longer presentation, and I'm going to do it in 5 minutes. So ready? Hold on to your pants. So here's our research. Here's really what we're going to talk about in our 4.5 minutes. We'll talk about our research, some essential qualities that we found, some of the benefits and challenges to this model of grant making, and some of the conclusions we found. So in general, we approach this work because we believe that philanthropy has the capacity to be democratized. And there's a lot of ways to do that. And this is a method in which we get closer to democratization. So here's our research. So who decides? We surveyed 8 participatory grant-making funds from around the world and conducted both online surveys and interviews. That was from 2014. And then we worked with Funding Free Knowledge the Wiki Way with the Wikimedia dive into, in fact, the largest participatory grant-making organization in the world. So we'll hear a little bit more about that. Here are the groups that we talked with. And you can see that they're diverse in terms of geography, their focus, whether it's sexual rights, health rights, whether it was a feminist fund, whether it was about disability rights. So what we tried to do was really get a broad, really like a broad sample of different foundations that use this model so that we could get a real slice into the method. So here are some essential qualities. We believe, and we found, that the core of participatory grant making is that the decision-making, participation of people impacted by the funds programs will guarantee that grants are allocated to those who will use the funds most effectively, right? So this is very different than a program officer reviewing applications within a portfolio, within a framework directed from their program director or anything else, and making those decisions. This, rather, is very much in the people's hands. So, and again, I apologize. I'm definitely racing through this. And usually I'm very funny when I present, but I'm trying to keep it very brief. So we assume that the expertise and the lived experiences are necessary tools to evaluate these proposals. That really people bring themselves to the table, and that's who should be evaluating. And that community-based organizations are accountable to the people that they serve, right? And accountable to the people that they serve in these areas of grant making. And it strengthens local leadership, right? So if local folks are making funding decisions about local programs with local implications, there's a cycle of accountability that adds strength. And it leverages that local knowledge, very much like what you were just talking about the water in people's homes. Like, that never would have occurred if they talked to the women, which is broadly right about human rights. So, what are the essential qualities? We found that, that all of those that were, I think I just lost my audio, back again. That those directly impacted individuals or program participants, when in the driver's seats, found that those decisions had a special impact in the way that those grant-making decisions were made. And that the funds select, that most of the funds that select peer review panelists are through an application process. So again, broadly, as people come to be a part of the participatory grant-making function, they are evaluated in a community process. And that the funds are granting predominantly to small organizations with small budgets. So I think this is really critically important because participatory grant-making funds are generally smaller, and they pipeline small organizations into a track of development towards accepting larger grants from more institutional donors. I'm really racing. So, most of these funds share some qualities. Some of which are that they do small grants to small organizations. They have very small staffs. So in other words, they're cost effective, right? These aren't like 30 staff people. Many of the participatory grant-making funds have 2 or 3 staff people. None of them have endowments. And most of them do not require a letter of intent, right? So it's a very low barrier of entry into getting resources. So some benefits. So this is like the bulk of our work. And I'm sure as you download the report and read it later, you'll see all about this. But innovation and flexibility, transparency, participation, accountability, leadership development, capacity building, cost effectiveness, and building solidarity in the field. This really is what participatory grant-making brings to the industry of philanthropy. And this is a game-changing approach to how really charity is being changed into a function of change through its own practice of philanthropy. So we can dig way into that. Find me in the halls later. So there are some challenges also. So throughout this entire research, how am I doing on time? I think I probably have like 1 minute left. Yeah, okay. So all of these funds have conflict of interest policies, obviously. And we could imagine that all foundations in philanthropy, in fact, have some amount of conflict of interest going on, and is negotiated project by project, grant by grant, or sometimes by portfolio. All of these have a very clear conversation and policy about that. They're all asking all the panelists to discuss their connections to applicants, and some of the solutions that have been identified by their participants is that by renewable funding, that they don't necessarily require those applicants to reapply. In other words, if you're a critical voice in the community, right, and you necessarily should be at the table because of your views and expertise of what's happening in the field, you may be outside of a regular cycle of grant making. So, I'm just going to say this. The diversity of income streams is a weakness of participatory grant-making funds. That there are very complex logistics associated with these. If you can imagine 30 people from 15 countries in 3 different languages reviewing 300 applications in 9 languages to consent on decision. It's complicated, it's costly, but those are logistics that these funds are regularly dealing with. There's a small number of staff, and almost always they're working with a fiscal sponsor, right? So again, if anybody's dealt with a fiscal sponsor, that's a blessing and a curse. So what did we learn? This is really my last slide, and probably I'm at 5 minutes and 40 seconds. But that really participatory grant-making funds function as a powerful intermediary. They really do connect the field and philanthropy in a way that is absolutely unique and pipelines leadership from the field into philanthropy and also NGOs into broader function and capacity within regions. They function as learning hubs for activists, right? So people on the ground who are living and working and grappling with the challenges that are trying to be addressed by philanthropy are at the center of these decisions. Networks are developed and knowledge is built. And they're a cost-effective entry point, right? So that areas, much larger institutions that could never possibly handle a grant for $4,000, for $2,000, for $1,000, could give a $3 million grant to a sex worker participatory grant-making fund, and then really fill out a field of knowledge by working with that participatory grant-making fund and managing the hundreds of small grants that a larger foundation could never possibly manage. And that we really believe that this model we found to be very intelligent in unique, local, and culturally relevant ways, that it's scalable and it's a very effective approach. So obviously there's a lot more to say about this, but here's my little bit of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. So Diana, Katie, and Jason each have deep experience with the participatory grant-making model, and I'd like to have them each tell you a little bit about their approach and how their institutions do participatory grant-making. So we'll start with Diana.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So this is like Maddie's history of our universe in 3 minutes or less. Historically, disability in philanthropy and like in society, if addressed at all, has been seen as a charity or a service issue, and persons with disabilities have been seen as objects to be done to or done for. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which entered into force in 2008 as a result of global activism of persons with disabilities themselves, whose slogan is "Nothing about us without us," marked a paradigm shift towards a human rights-based approach, where persons with disabilities are seen now, at least in international law, as subjects and as persons first, persons with disabilities. The Disability Rights Fund was launched in 2008, along with the convention, to fill a gap in human rights and development funding for support of this rights-based approach to disability. The fund's mission is to support the leadership of people with disabilities in the Global South to advance rights using the convention as a tool. We are an intermediary grant maker as our most participatory grant makers, and that means that we raise the money that we then give out. We're also a pooled fund, which means that we pool money from multiple and diverse donors, government donors, human rights funders, individuals, private foundations, public foundations. And we're a collaboration between donors and the disability community. A key emphasis, and I'll talk more about the collaboration aspect of it in a little bit. A key emphasis, of course, of all human rights treaties, and several groups I was in this morning talked about this, is participation. And in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, participation is seen as a principle, a right, and an obligation. In Article 4, states parties are mandated to include representative organizations of people with disabilities in the implementation and monitoring of rights at national level. So to uphold this emphasis on participation and, in fact, to do better and more informed work, the Disability Rights Fund uses a participatory model where people with disabilities themselves define the strategy, the grant-making strategy, do the outreach to the disability community around the world, determine the grants, etc. How? How is this done? Well, people with disabilities themselves, and I'm talking about a diversity of people with disabilities. Everyone always asks me, what are you talking about? Is it physical disability? No, it's not only physical disability. We're talking about sensory impairments, people who are blind, deaf, or deafblind, also people with intellectual disabilities, people with psychosocial disabilities, albinos, little people, a whole spectrum of disability. People with disabilities are key actors in the fund and in the majority at all levels of the work that we do. And that is from the governance of the fund to our advisory group and to our staffing. So people with disabilities from the Global South are the majority. We have a global advisory panel of 12 members, 9 of whom are leaders with disabilities from the Global South and diverse in terms of their disability, age, gender, et cetera, who are nominated to our advisory panel by what is called the International Disability Alliance. It's a membership organization of membership organizations of people with disabilities, both at international level and at regional level. So there's organizations such as the World Blind Union, World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, World Federation of the Deaf, et cetera, and regional organizations of people with disabilities. From the Global Advisory Panel, we have 4 members who are chosen by their peers to sit together with donor representatives in our grant-making committee. Our grant-making committee works by consensus to finalize our grant-making strategy and determine our grants. And the staff of the fund are majority persons with disabilities. So our structure upholds the participatory principle and also nothing about us without us. And I would say, and now I have to conclude because I'm running over, that involving persons with disabilities at all levels makes us smarter, more credible, more accessible to the people we're trying to reach, that mixing donors and persons with disabilities together enables the disability community to influence the donors, but also to better understand how funders work. So it's a two-way learning. And in conclusion, I'm just going to say that since 2008, we have opened our grant making to 31 countries around the world, and we've given out over $15 million in grants for rights advocacy of organizations of people with disabilities themselves to do things such as put in place a National Disability Act, fight violence against women with disabilities, put in place policies for inclusive education, et cetera. And I can answer your questions later.
Thank you, Diana. Katie?
Thank you.
Can you tell us about Wikimedia?
Yes, and explain
Foundation.
that whole thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Love from the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit organization that supports Wikipedia in its hundreds of languages and many other sister project sites that advance free knowledge. And to advance the participatory approach that we're talking about, I want to ask you all a few questions. can you raise your hand or wave in some way if you have ever read Wikipedia or one of the sister projects? Okay, awesome. Now please raise your hand if you've contributed, either as an editor or uploaded a photo to Wikimedia Commons, or very cool. Okay, and if anyone wants more tips on that, there's a button that says edit on every Wikipedia page, or come find me and I'll show you afterwards. The last question I have for you is about whether any of you have ever donated when that Wikipedia fundraiser comes up, says, please, just give us a few dollars. Okay, well, thank you, awesome. I want to share with you a little bit about how that money that comes in from people like you and me and people all over the world, how we determine what that gets spent on, because it's really fascinating. Most of the money, as you might guess, is spent maintaining the servers and supporting the technical and engineering infrastructure to Wikipedia and the other projects. But some of it, a portion of it, is spent in grants. And those grants go to people like you and me all over the world who have local context and partnerships and local lived expertise that can help advance the free knowledge movement wherever they may be. And how did this all come about? I want to share a brief history with you about that. A few years ago, people started coming to the Wikimedia Foundation and asking for a few pesos or a few dollars or a few euros to organize an edit-a-thon. They wanted coffee or pizza or cookies. Or they were partnering with an educational institution and they needed to pay someone's transport or something like that. And we thought this was a good thing because we believe in San Francisco, we don't have all the answers, we can't do all the things that people around the world can do. So we started giving small grants to people to do this work. This was actually just done by one person, this model of someone sort of reading an application and doing their best to make decisions, but it was very contrary to the Wiki way. The Wiki way, just like Wikipedia, is filled with total decentralization. Who's in charge of Wikipedia? Everyone, all of us, no one. It's very complicated. So we designed a grants program that really took into consideration our core Wiki values. And those are really designing the grants programs, the many that we have today, supporting people, again, in tens of countries all over the world. Those principles, and I hope you'll find me later for more, are accountability, transparency, collaboration and participation, shared power, stewardship, and internationalism. Probably there are other principles too. But those have really guided our grants program. Now we have over 50 people each year from so many countries helping to make decisions about where those funds can have the most impact. And we are now distributing about over 6 million a year in this way. And I hope to tell you a bit more about it later. Thank you.
Now I'll turn it over to Jason.
Sure, so I'm the obligatory academic on the panel. But I'm actually one foot in the academic world and one foot in the world of practice, having been in philanthropy since I was 22, involved with my family foundation, and since I was 24, joined the North Star Fund, which is a participatory grant maker in New York City. So I'm providing some of the domestic context, because so much of what we talk about with participatory grant making looks internationally. But research shows there's about 1,800 community and public foundations all over the world. About 1,000 of those are based here in the United States and have different levels of participatory grant making in their work. And what it looks like here in the US rarely uses the language of human rights. Instead, we hear the language of social justice, civil rights, equity, equality, but the practices are very comparable. So the North Star Fund is a New York City foundation, 33 years old, moves about $4 million a year to support grassroots organizing and activism in the 5 boroughs of New York. But that grant making, while raised from over 4,000 different donors, from $25 to 6-figure checks, is allocated by a group of activists who are selecting each other to be the decision makers of where that money moves. And its tradition in history has been, since it started, funding the work that no one else funds, taking the first risk, taking the big risk, funding the controversial work, funding the marginalized and the excluded activists within the broader city environment. And part of the impact, I think, when you look at participatory grant making, has been that there's a high rate of failure. Many of the groups that were funded by the North Star Fund no longer exist. But simultaneously, there's an incredibly high rate of success. That many of the biggest groups in New York City advocating on behalf of marginalized communities got their first grant from the North Star Fund, 5, 10, 20 years ago, and talk about it as the seed capital that helped them start. The group of mothers in the Bronx who got their first $5,000 grants to become mothers on the move. Or the group of immigrants in Queens that got the first grant that became the New York Immigration Coalition, and having really become the forefront organizations pushing for human rights work in New York City. And it's messy and complicated, and the challenges of how you engage a really wide and diverse city like New York City in the decision-making is a challenging one. And the other piece, which I'm also seeing now, a second circle that I'm part of, that I co-founded 2 years ago called Funding Queerly, and we fund LGBT organizing in communities of color and rural communities around the country, and are actually working now to become participatory as we approach our 3rd year, is this question of who gets to decide and how does power engage. That one of the tensions of participatory grant making and the power of it is turning power over. And the challenge of it is turning power over. That how do you not disempower donors at the same time that you empower others? How do you share power or amplify power in the decision-making process? That's been a really interesting exploration. So having done for 10 years with the North Star Fund, now trying to translate into a very different model. They're open questions, and I think they're open questions for all of us, and welcome your questions about what it looks like domestically and internationally. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Tell me if you have trouble hearing me. I put my mic back. So we are all very passionate about participatory grant making, and we can go on for a while, as you can see. We're all having trouble keeping to a few minutes. So, but I want to turn the power over to you for questions, and we'll start a dialogue about what it means for us and what you might like to hear more about.
Thank you for that. That was all really, really interesting. I'm Kate Donald from the Centre for Economic and Social Rights. I wanted to ask a clarification question, actually, from Matthew about, you were talking about some of the challenges, and then you said that kind of one solution is the renewable grants. Could you explain that? I didn't quite understand exactly the issue. Thank you.
You are right to have been confused, because as I was speaking, I was like, I'm not making any sense right now, so I apologize for that. It is sometimes the case in particular communities of concern that there are unique voices that are essential to understanding the nature of what's happening in the field, and that those individuals necessarily come from organizations that qualify for resources from such a fund. So oftentimes funds will resolve an internal sort of cycle of a conflict of interest by providing multi-year support for some core organizations so that some of those key stakeholders can still participate as voices of and deciders in the larger process in the annual cycles. So in other words, they're not at the table making their own decision, nor are they leaving the room for other people to make a decision, and then they come back and say, did I get it? You know, that whole thing has been removed. So structurally, they just adopt it like that. So I apologize for the confusion.
We'll take a couple of questions.
Thank you. I really appreciated the presentations. I'm Bill Simmons from the University of Arizona. I do some work on participatory human rights education, and I want to push you a little bit and see how you handle some of the critiques of participatory grant funding. And I think the critiques kind of parallel the critiques of participatory development. And so I'm thinking about when, and I'll just use Matthew's examples. Matthew mentions strengthening local leadership, and yet we found from development models that when you strengthen local leadership, that is usually exacerbating hierarchies in villages and towns, that you are funding a certain group who already have certain power over others. And then when you say that you're having groups decide what will work most effectively, I think the word effectively needs to be interrogated. because I think as Jason's talking about, what you and I might think is effective, or what a budget model might think of as effective, might not really be what is effective to people on the ground. And I just wonder how maybe your benchmarks or your outcomes might take into account some more critical ways of thinking of what effective means. Thank you.
I could take another 2 questions and then we'll come back.
Hi, Tony Talbot from the University of Dayton, so I didn't have far to travel this morning. The great panel. I just wonder if you could contextualize this for some of us who aren't as familiar with the whole process. What amount of money are we looking at compared to the total overall, all foundations and the number of participatory grant-making institutions versus all in general? Thank you.
Hi, Michael Goodhart, University of Pittsburgh. Thanks very much for this. I was interested in the idea about turning over power to the participants. And particularly, I'm wondering how much power does actually get turned over? One can imagine that the criteria for making the awards of the grants might still be quite prescriptive according to a donor's wishes, even though the people making the selections are people drawn from the community, and there might be donors' reasons for wanting to do that. On the other hand, if there aren't, does that undermine the cogency of the program? So if you could elaborate on that, it would be fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Here.
Sure. Well, context, the estimates are there between 90 to 120,000 funders, private philanthropic funders that are in existence around the world. The guess is there's somewhere around 2,000 or so that have a public or community foundation model, which likely includes some level of participatory grant making. So and then in the US, we know there's about $55 billion being given by foundations. We don't have a good estimate for what percent come with a participatory tag, but I would guess it's a similarly small slice. And I think that actually goes to your question about the power dynamics, because it's a very different, participatory grant makers are actually trying to change and challenge the power dynamics of philanthropy, rather than making new power dynamics from a top-down participatory planning process that might elevate or exacerbate hierarchies. Those hierarchies already exist within traditional philanthropy that is present, and actually participatory grant making often serves as a challenge to the existing hierarchies, still knowing there are imperfections, still knowing there are those relationships. And then, yes, the power question, I'd say, as an individual donor, I can always just take my grant from my family foundation to the North Star Fund and go elsewhere if I disagree with what North Star does. But because it pools money from so many donors, there's also a cushioning of the power impact that any individual donor has, and the level of power they can exert on the activist decision-making because of that collective nature of how the money is raised and given.
I love these questions and these challenges, and this reminds me a lot of my day-to-day conversations with many people. So thank you for the pushing of us and pushing on these questions. I want to speak to the how much power actually gets turned over question. And I think that it depends so much on the context. And one of the things that this group of panelists are really keen on is pushing more funders who hold money, who therefore hold power, to move in more participatory approaches. And there's a lot of ways to do that. It's not just giving a pot of money to someone else and a group of people that we think might be representative of people that might be funded with that money. But there are a range of ways to be influenced by whoever you're hoping to involve with those funds. And so it's not all or nothing. There's a spectrum. There's ways to have advisors. There's ways to have community members make fund decisions entirely themselves, to set the criteria themselves. I mean, we have really seen a range of approaches, and it really depends on the context. I think we would like to see more innovation and more people trying different models here, but we have seen a real range of options. It's not a this or that kind of question.
Yeah, I think I will address the question that came up about, well, is there really power from those who are deciding on the grants if the priorities are set by donors? I mean, actually, that's, as Katie was saying, there's a range of approaches, but at least in the case of a lot of the participatory grant makers that were in the study who decides, that's not the model. The model is that the participants, the beneficiary communities, are setting the strategies and the priorities. And that's certainly the case with the Disability Rights Fund, and it couldn't be the other way around because, frankly, because there's been so little funding for people with disabilities themselves and projects led by people with disabilities, donors have no clue who the actors are, what the priorities should be, you know, what the groups can do, how to make funding accessible to a variety of people with different impairments. So it is really essential that people with disabilities themselves are the ones who are saying, this is what needs to happen, these are the priorities now. And in the Disability Rights Fund, we change our priorities on at least an annual basis, based on the advice from our global leaders with disabilities. Because we're talking about a movement that is ever changing, a movement that has priorities that shift over time. And so it's really, that's a key piece of it.
I guess I would say, and I want to address really the same question, that there are certain institutional donors that want to get behind this practice and who invest in these participatory grant-making funds. And I think that there's something in it for them, right? What's in it for them is essentially they get to have a very high-impact small grants program that they don't have to administer. They administer one grant, right? So here's my $350,000, and broadly speaking, here's the range of work we want to cover. Go for it. They get access to a hub of learning and activist and critical thinking about what's happening in the field that they could never pay for otherwise. And that only happens in that sort of ecology. I think the other benefit they get is big institutional donors can deal with very complicated, very front-end rights issues that their institution could normally not fund publicly, right? So it's not something that they can invest in heavily to deal with in the rights space, but they can work with a participatory grant-making fund to do their learning, to understand a strategy, to have the kind of iterative process that a multi-cycle grant-making program allows, so that the field knowledge, the experience, the feedback from the grants, the reporting that's coming back helps fill out a larger institutional strategy that fits the priorities that emerge from that participatory grant-making fund. So there's an ecology that can get set. I don't think that any of us are saying that it's this way or the highway. I think that in a rights-based space, this sort of work plays a unique role in the learning, the discovery, and the addressing of critical issues. But the larger sort of structural developmental pieces oftentimes are then can have these lessons applied into, right? So it plays a role within an arc of investment that foundations look to do.
Thank you. I'll take another round of questions.
Hello, and thank you very much. My name is Lou Berenz. I'm representing SIT, the School for International Training and World Learning. So we rely heavily on all kinds of different funding mechanisms. Just kind of in the vein of nothing about us without us, and how things can change in the vernacular and how we're approaching these things. I was wondering if the term disability in itself is somewhat top-down, in that some communities, there is a certain negative connotation to identifying themselves as someone with a disability. And I use an example of in India, you know, the term is differently abled. And this is something for me, and I think some of the communities that we work with that are differently abled, if this is something that you've thought about, or is this coming from some of the communities that you're working with, or if there's another kind of term out there I'm just curious about that. Thank you.
I think it's better with the mic.
We're live streaming this session, so using the mic means people can hear it.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. This is such an interesting panel and giving me food for thought. If you could, I'd appreciate an example of how you've gone about finding people, the grantees, or people from the most directly impacted communities that are participating in the process for one of your grants. And also, if you think about how to also make sure that you're including people who are at the intersections, so who might not generally even be in the conversations of directed or impacted communities.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'll just take those two, and we'll just go on.
Sure. So I just wanted to address the question directed about disability. The term disability in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has really gone through a paradigm shift. So disability is not seen as inherent in the individual. Instead, disability is what happens between an individual who has a difference, is differently abled, if you will, and barriers in society, attitudinal barriers, physical barriers, informational barriers, et cetera. So when I say person with disability, it doesn't mean a person who has any specific kind of impairment. What it means is a person who is dealing with the disabilities that society is imposing on them because they have a difference. I hope that's clear. And that is what the international standard means by disability. In terms of people at the crossroads, I just wanted to say that we do a lot of cross-movement work because people with disabilities are not just people who are differently abled. They're also women, they're indigenous people, they're children, they're people who need education, et cetera, et cetera. So we do cross-movement funding. We have done some of the first funding between the indigenous peoples movement and the disability rights movement, bringing those issues together. First funding between the LGBT movement and the disability rights movement, et cetera.
I would just say, I think it's a great question. With funding queerly, we're grappling with this right now, that these participatory grant making is never going to be perfect. Collective participatory grant making is called voting in how we allocate our government dollars. That is actually, at some level, the same collective decision making over the allocation of resources. With funding queerly, we're a national group that last year moved $200,000, which is a very small pot in the United States. And yet still the groups we've supported, for many of them, were the first institutional funding they received. We're trying to build in a participatory process. And if we did we're all volunteers, if we did a large call to every LGBT activist in the country, we'd be overloaded. So we are actually struggling with this question right now. We work with the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice as our sponsor. So we've gone out to all of their grantees, asked for people who would be interested to bring in those voices, and then we'll have some selection process, which we know will be biased based on our own knowledge and experience, and then next year we'll do better. But I would say one other piece, just because I know we're wrapping, this is also, as a community of scholars, you should know that this is a very under-researched and under-examined area of work. And so I'll just put my invitation out. I've just stepped into this new role as the Kellogg Chair at the Johnson Center at Grand Valley State. We're launching a 3-year project with the Global Fund for Community Foundations and others on linking research and practice on collective giving, which includes participatory grant making. And what we research is what gets talked about, is what gets adopted into practice. So there's a lot of room for growth. We got some ideas and experimentation, and the research Maddie did was groundbreaking in being just asking these questions and doing a set of 8 case studies to try to start encapsulating it. But it also shows us how much more we have to go.
Yeah, we practitioners want more.
Thank you. I we'll wrap it up now. Jason was just referencing the report, Who Decides? It is, how do we get it?
I think it's on the website, right? Yeah, it's on this conference website.
Great, it's on the conference website. We have research on human rights funding on the SPHR15 website, and there are copies out there as well. But I'd like to thank you for joining us today and thank the panelists for being here. Cool. Thanks so much.